I like that.
They know it already. Welcome to this evening talk of our dear teacher Urmila Patil. I'm excited and I get nervous and things. But I want to introduce her properly. Most of you know her because she has been teaching here for the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies as a part-time faculty. But just to let you know who she is and where she's coming from in terms of her academic studies. She did her BA and MA in Sanskrit in India, and she got her PhD in history or Asian studies?
Asian studies. Yeah.
Asian studies at the University of Austin. As you can see, one of her main interests is in studying the Brahmin community of Maharashtra. And she has taught in several places around California.
Yeah.
She has lectured at UCLA. She's currently teaching in the University of Irvine.
Right.
Irvine.
And that's saying something, right? A permanent nomad. So.
Currently, she is part of this team of faculty, the Yoga Studies program. She has been teaching Hinduism, Sanskrit, Asian religions, and her research interests are in colonial India, intellectual traditions in Sanskrit, royal gastronomy, and she's currently working on her publication related to what she will talk about today. So give her a nice...
Introduction. I think that's one of the best parts about giving a public talk, right? You get to hear nice things about yourself and you get to be the center of attraction and everything, loving it totally. Okay, so the title of my talk is Meat or No Meat, the Politics of Brahmanical Identities in Pre-Colonial and Colonial Western India. So basically this talk is about how the consumption of meat in a particular Brahmin community became a huge problem at one point of time in history in India, and how did other Brahmin communities responded to that particular community. So basically this talk is about how food becomes a tool, a political tool, and why is it that food becomes such a powerful signifier of community identity. So that's basically the topic. But before I sort of get to the meaty part or the main part of my, sorry, no pun intended. Before I do that, I thought it would be good to sort of, talk a little bit about what is the meaning of food in the Indian context or the Hindu context? What is it that makes food so significant? What is the web of meanings that underlies food and the act of eating food? So I'm just kind of, going to give you sort of a brief sort of sketch of how food is looked at in Hindu scriptures and in Hindu practice. And after that, we can just talk about, or maybe I can talk about the historical stuff, okay? So, all right, so I thought I would start with this little prayer that we used to say as children before eating. And this prayer is in Marathi, which is my first language, and this is how it goes, okay? Vadani kavala gheta, nama ghya Shri Harice, सहज हवन होते, नाम घेता फुकाचे, जीवन करे जीवित्वा, अन्न हे पूर्ण ब्रह्म, udara bharana no he, zanije yajna. Now the meaning is there for you to read. So before you take that bite, say the name of Hari. Hari is basically Vishnu, right? One of the prominent or major Hindu gods. When you say it, that's the name of Vishnu, digestion, and the word that is used is havana, it occurs easily. Food is verily absolute, perfect Brahman. It creates life while living. This is not mere filling of the belly. Know it to be an act of yajna. Okay, now there are some words such as havana and yajna. What do they mean? I'll explain that. But this, this chanting, this particular prayer, it beautifully captures what food means to a Hindu practitioner, right? So before you take that bite, say the name of Hari, right? So why? Because the act of eating is not just that. The assumption is that there's a Godhead within you. And when you eat, you're actually offering something, offering food, a devotional offering to the God within, right? So it becomes this act of sacrifice, this act of offering. And you know, whenever any ritual is performed, you chant mantras, right? Now mantras is something that really sort of energizes that particular ritual action. So similarly, when you're eating, take the name of God, which acts as a mantra in the act of digestion, right? So when the food is digested, the God within you feels pleased, and then he makes you healthier. So that's sort of the understanding. Food is verily absolute perfect Brahman. Now this is sort of the idea that's very common in the culture where I grew up. So food, you never treat food just as a means of subsistence, but food is something which is equal to, you know, the essence of the universe, which is called Brahman in Indian philosophical texts. And it creates life while living. So food is not something which is dead. It has a prana, it has a life of its own, and that's how it is able to nourish you. Okay? And it is not the mere filling of the belly, but it is an act of yajna. So I think that just kind of, you know, expresses a whole range of ideas that are important in the Hindu culture. All right, now, so what are some of the other ways in which Hindu texts portray the sublime nature of food? So I'm just kind of, you know, giving you a few sort of citations or, you know, just ideas from some of the important texts. So Brahmanas, right? Brahmanas are the prose commentary on the Vedas. They explain the rituals. You know, they have a lot of you know, myths about creation and how different gods came into being and stuff like that. They also tell you how to perform a particular ritual correctly. So in the Brahmanas, right, the food is a very important part of creation myths. In fact, there's a creation myth about how the god of beings or the god of creation called Prajapati, he first created Agni or fire from his mouth. Now because fire was created from his mouth, fire was always hungry and it wanted to eat something. Now the first thing that fire saw was Prajapati himself, the god himself, and fire ran to eat Prajapati. Now in order to save himself, Prajapati had to create food for fire. And that's how he created the plants, that's how he created vegetation. And then fire, you know, no longer chased Prajapati and just kind of, it was happy, right? So food, okay, so creation begins when there is food on earth. Now the Upanishads, the esoteric or the philosophical texts in the Vedic tradition, what do they say? They say food is the origin and the returning place of all beings. And I have a quotation from the Taittiriya Upanishads. So it says, from food surely they are born, on food alone they live, and into food they pass in the end. So beings, the way we are, our existence completely depends on food, not just as a source of nourishment, but the material reality of our bodies, that also is part of, or is a result of eating good food. And when we die, will ultimately pass into food, which I think is probably, you know, just a way of saying that you will return to the elements, because food ultimately comes from the elements, right? All right, now, the third point, the third scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. We have, you know, I see so many of my students here, and we have been talking about, you know, the significance of yajna or sacrifice in this, you know, beautifully philosophical texts. So the Bhagavad Gita tells us about the interlinkage between food and ultimate reality, Brahman, right? So in the third chapter, the verse 14 and 15, they tell us that people, all right, they come from food, all right? Now where does food come from? Food comes from rain. Rain comes from sacrifice, the ritual of sacrifice. The ritual of sacrifice comes from ritual action, and ritual action comes from the Vedas, And where do the Vedas come from? The Vedas come from Brahman itself, right? Brahman as the ultimate reality. So clearly in this causal link, food is the product of Brahman, right? There's a connection between the ultimate reality and food that cannot be negated, and that's why food is so important. Okay, now given the cosmic significance of food, there's an idea in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita that you should not be eating food alone, right? Because there's a lot of beings that depend on the food that you eat, a lot of beings that depend on you as well. So the idea that one has to share one's meal with others is very important. And therefore, you take any Hindu ritual, the sharing of food is a central practice. If you go to any temple, after performing the worship or the sort of this kind of puja as we call it, after offering the services of puja to the god, one always offers some kind of food, even if it is just sugar. And after assuming that God has symbolically eaten that food is redistributed among the devotees as the grace of God, right? So there's that. Then, there are several ancestral rites where, ancestors are offered food. The idea is that even in their afterlife, they are nourished by food. And even only when they are given food, only when they are nourished by the giving of food, that they will be happy and they will make their children happier by blessing them in their afterlife. Similarly, animals, right? So feeding cows or feeding birds such as crows, it's considered to give you a lot of religious merit, right? So it's an act of punya, or religious merit, as they say. And of course, the idea that food has to be distributed among fellow human beings, the poorer people, that is also very, it's a common practice, because again, that is supposed to give you a lot of positive religious merit, and it gives you a lot of positive karma. All right, so these are some of the ways in which food is sort of portrayed as this a very significant fact of human existence. All right, moving on. Now, because food is so important, there were various questions that were developed around food. One of the questions is what kind of food, right? And of course, some of you might be familiar with this classification. That food is classified into sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic food. And it is the 17th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that contains a description of what is sattvic, tamasic, and rajasic. So sattvic food is described as something that is pure, something that's fresh, something that's wholesome, something that gives rise to the feeling of being satisfied, right? That is very important. Something that gives you strength, something that purifies you. Okay, that's sattvic food. Now, what is rajasic food? Now, rajasic food is something that's bitter, which is excessively sour, which is excessively spicy and dry and pungent, and it's something that produces pain and grief and suffering in you. Well, food is not just the only thing that does that, but anyway, it is considered to be one of the things which can give rise to these sort of emotions. And what is tamasic food? Now, tamasic food also gives rise to a lot of negative emotions, but it is something which is stale, all right? So putting food in the refrigerator, that's not a good idea. It's a food that is tasteless, so it has to taste good too. Okay, just because, food is, that food which doesn't taste good is good for you, it's a myth. Food has to also taste good. Something that's putrid, something that's rotten, something that's rejected, all of these are tamasic foods and have to be completely avoided. Okay, so that's sort of the one classification about food. Now, the second question is, who prepares the food, right? Food is not just this kind of, object with intrinsic qualities, but the person who is cooking also affects the quality of food. In fact, there are several Ayurvedic treatises that talk about the ideal characteristics of a cook. Okay, so a cook is expected to be from a good family, someone who is truthful, someone who is sincere, someone who is not greedy, someone who has a pleasant disposition, someone who is just, happy and satisfied in general. Okay, because if a person who is happy and satisfied cooks a meal, then those qualities are also transferred in that meal, and the eater also experiences some of those, or rather, becomes satisfied and happy himself. So that's the idea. Now, food also has a distinct social dimension, right? So, who keeps company when eating in a group, right? Now, the philosophical texts talk about, food has to be shared, and it's a universal fact, and ideally it's an egalitarian practice, right? You should be sharing your food with everybody. But the sociology of Hinduism does not exactly reflect that kind of ideal, because you probably know, right, that Hindu society is divided in 4 classes. Brahmins is the highest class. They are the priests, the teachers, the scholars, and they are considered to be very pure, right? Intrinsically, morally, they are the most superior. Now, the next group of people is the Kshatriyas, or the warrior community. Now, they are also okay, but because they are warriors, they practice violence, and therefore they are sort of lower than the Brahmins. Now, the third category is that of the Vaishyas, or the merchant community. Okay, now they are lower than the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, and the lowest category is that of the Shudras, right? The laborers, who are considered to be the most impure, ritually as well as morally. And there's a body of texts called the Dharmashastras, right? Law books, as they are called. They sort of contain various rules and regulations about how different communities should be behaving, how they should interact with each other, what should they eat, what sort of rituals should they perform, and things like that. So the Dharmashastras actually prohibit the Shudras from sharing any meal with the Brahmins. It's considered to be a great sin. So typically groups that have an equal status, for example, the Brahmins, they will eat together. Kshatriyas will eat in, like they will share a table. The Vaishyas will eat together. The Shudras will eat together. And usually there will be no interaction between these groups. Okay, that's the theory, and it is enforced to a large extent in practice also. Okay, so it is not just sort of this kind of abstract theory. But even today, in India, you will find that many Brahmins, they would even avoid the sight of a Shudra when they are eating food, because the idea is that looking at a person from a lower caste will somehow defile their food. And some people, not all, do believe in that. Okay, now, is food vegetarian or non-vegetarian? That's also a question that probably many Brahmins or members of the Baniya community, Baniyas are the merchants, they will ask. And a large, more than half of Hindu population, they're meat eaters. And about 30% of the population, of the Hindu population, they are vegetarians. But those who are vegetarians, this is a very important question, probably more important than any other question, because the idea is that, in fact, many of my friends who do not eat meat, they tell me that, the reason why I do not eat meat is because the pain and the suffering that a particular animal has experienced, it kind of inheres in their meat and their food, and therefore I avoid it, because I don't want to get those similar feelings. So that's sort of their explanation. But anyway, moving on, towards the topic, can a Brahmin eat meat? Okay, should the Brahmin eat meat? And what is the view of Hindu scriptures about Brahmins eating meat or strictly vegetarian diet? And before we talk about this, it's important to ask whether we are looking for any kind of coherent theory in the Hindu scriptures. Well, my advice would be don't, because you won't find it. No, really, because many people think that, Hindu scriptures, they sort of promote a particular view, especially they recommend that you should not be eating meat. that's not true. In fact, the scriptures are deeply ambivalent about the question of whether or not to eat meat. And here are some of the scriptures. So the Vedas, right, the first or the earliest scriptures of Hinduism, they are all about the hymns that were chanted during the ritual of sacrifice, right? And sacrifice, right, offering various kinds of oblations was a central practice for the Vedic Aryans. And not just the grains, but also different kinds of animals were offered as sacrificial victims. That included, bulls or horses, goats, okay, barren cows also. There's a lot of so much controversy going on about whether to eat beef or not, whether Hindus eating beef. No, but if you look at the Vedas, yes, the Vedas do tell us that some cows, especially if they were barren, they were offered in sacrificial rituals. Okay, and after the animal was sacrificed, the meat was actually shared by the Brahmin priests. Okay, so not just the Kshatriyas, not just the hosts, but the performers of the sacrifice, the Brahmins themselves ate meat. However, later in the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, you also find statements about the importance of non-violence and how one should not be eating meat. They condemn the consumption of meat as a negative karma. In fact, I have just some references from the Shatapatha Brahman. It's one of the Brahmanas, which says that animals eat their eater in the next world. That's why you should avoid it. Because if you eat that animal, then after you die, that animal is going to eat you or eat your soul. That's even worse, right? Now the Upanishads, right? Now the Upanishads, they question the legitimacy or the predominance of the ritual of sacrifice, which was getting too technical for them, and it just they believe that it led people away from the goal of true self-realization, which according to them could be realized only through asceticism and not by performing ritual. So again, they also, the Upanishads kind of condemn the consumption of meat. Now, the Dharma Shastras, right, especially the texts such as Manusmriti, what is their view, right? Should Brahmins be eating meat? Well, yes, some kinds of meats are allowed. And there's like a long list of animals that can be eaten by Brahmins. Five clawed animals. I don't know who they are. Okay? 5 clawed animals, I don't know. Go figure. Then chicken. They can eat chicken. Certain kinds of fish. They can eat a porcupine. I didn't write that, guys. A tortoise. Okay. A hare. Okay, so these are the kind of animals that are fit for consumption. Now, the general logic seems to be that you can eat animals that can be domesticated, and you can also eat some wild animals, but you cannot eat animals that wander about in villages. For example, dogs and pigs, because they eat impure stuff. And their meat is actually eaten by the most abominable of communities called the Chandalas. Okay, that's sort of a Dharma Shastri construction. It's the 5th category of people who are lower even than the Shudras because they eat the meat of pigs and especially dogs. And so if you're a Brahmin, you just cannot be eating dog ever. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. And then, certain meats are allowed, and then certain vegetables are not okay. Especially the root vegetables like carrots, onions, and garlic. And the logic is perhaps because they grow inside the soil, there's a lot of microorganisms that are attached to them, and therefore they must not be eaten. That's one logic. But the Dharma Shastras, they don't really tell you why something should not be done. They usually like, hey, just don't do this, okay? I'm telling you. You have to trust me. That's sort of the general tone of the Dharma Shastras. So, I do not have a perfectly great explanation about why certain things are allowed and certain things are not allowed. But usually, moving on, if you look at Manusmriti, the general idea seems to be that if you offer meat in a sacrifice, and if you eat the meat that is offered in a sacrifice, it is okay if you eat it. In fact, you should eat it. If you refuse the meat that is offered in the sacrifice, then you are committing a sin. Okay, so that's the idea. So the intention matters. So if you're killing an animal just for, to just kind of, make this sumptuous dish, and in order to just gain some kind of pleasure, no, that's not a good aim. However, if you're sacrificing an animal with a larger goal of performing a sacrifice and making, pleasing the gods, and then if you take a little bit of share from the sacrificed animal, that's perfectly okay. So that's the view of Manu, who is this very influential Dharma Shastra writer. Now, and also, of course, if your life is in danger, then also you can eat meat. So it's called apad dharma in Sanskrit. So if there's a circumstance when you eat meat, when in order to save life you eat meat, it's perfectly okay. Because being alive is probably more important than eating vegetarian food, right? Because if you're dying, yes, don't kill yourself. Just go ahead and eat whatever is available. Yajnavalkya, okay, another influential Dharma Shastra commentator. He largely agrees with Manu. All right, so he says, if an animal is killed and eaten for purposes other than sacrifice, the defaulter rots in hell for as many days as the hair on the animal's body. This is really hardcore, right? I mean, that's, exactly. That's the view of Yajnavalkya. But then, again, if you see, the eating of the meat itself is not a problem. Right? It is only the purpose for which you eat meat that is in question. Now you find a similar ambivalence in the Mahabharata too, right? This great Indian epic, which contains a lot of sections on how an individual should behave and what's his dharma or duty in relation to other communities and stuff like that. Now Anushasana Parva has a dialogue between two of its principal characters, Yudhishthira, who is a prince, a Pandava prince, and his grandfather Bhishma, right? Now that dialogue, okay, Yudhishthira is asking Bhishma about whether or not it is okay to eat meat, and Bhishma declares that non-violence is the ultimate dharma, ahimsa paramo dharma, and it is absolutely he champions uncompromising vegetarianism, and in the same text you go to Vanaparva, another chapter or another section, if you will. And there's this, discourse on how meat is okay. The speaker in this section is actually what is called as a dharma vyadha, a pious hunter. Okay. Now he's arguing with a Brahmin and telling him, hey, I'm a hunter. It's my dharma. It's my duty to hunt and kill. And Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita is all big on, how one should perform one's duty and everything. So if it is my duty as, to hunt, then how can you say that, hunting is bad? Because it is my dharma. And then, he also tells the Brahmin that when I hunt, when I kill the animals, the meat helps other people live. So I'm actually helping people live. So how is eating meat bad? How is my profession bad? So that's the argument. Now, why this kind of inconsistency? Why this ambivalence? Well, one explanation is that these texts, they were not created at one point of time, right? They were created in a long passage of time, and so some sections say this, some sections say that, which is very common when it comes to Hindu scriptures. You won't find just one voice advocating one particular view. So therefore, there are all kinds of inconsistencies. All right. Now, let me come to my meaty topic. Now, if the scriptures themselves are so ambivalent on the consumption of meat, how did the Brahmins, the community which was largely understood to be, as vegetarians, how did they look at the dietary practices of each other in history? Because, and I love history because, it kind of makes you aware of the complexities in the real world. you're no longer dealing just with the scriptures, but the real world with some real consequences and real people engaging with some of these ideas, which just kind of helps you kind of, get a more nuanced view about, vegetarianism. So, so I'll be now talking about this particular point in history, a specific time and a specific place, when meat eating was a huge problem for some Brahmin communities, and those who did not eat meat, the vegetarian Brahmins, they used vegetarianism as an instrument of power to project the lower position of the meat-eating Brahmins. So, when scholars talk about Indian society, they always posit this kind of polarity between Brahmins on the one hand and Shudras on the other, right? So Shudras are the lowest class and Brahmins are the highest class, and this kind of view, it's very popular in academia. But nobody talks about the politics among Brahmins, how there were different kind of sort of the play, the power play among Brahmins, how there were different hierarchies within the Brahmin class, and how some Brahmins were kind of victimized and targeted on several accounts. Nobody really talks about that. So I think for me personally, this is usually interesting. So the time period that I'm going to talk about is the early modern period, which starts around 1500 CE, and then I'll be moving on to the colonial period, all right, so 1920 CE. The region that I'll be focusing on is the Western Indian state of Maharashtra, and I'll be showing a map to you as well. Now, who are the principal actors in this story? The actors are the various Brahmin communities, castes, if you will, such as the Chippavans, the Deshasthas, the Karades, and the Saraswats. So we'll be knowing more about these communities a little later. All right, so this is the map of India, Maharashtra. So the politics that I'm going to discuss happened mainly in this coastal strip called Konkan. Okay, this is the Arabian Sea, and as you can see, Bombay is right here, and not just Bombay, but there were several ports around the western coast of India, and this was a place where trade flourished. Okay, in the early modern period, also because there were several rivers that flew that flew both from west to east and east to west and west to east. All right, which made Maharashtra a particularly fertile land. Okay, now when you have a fertile land, when you have people coming in and moving about for trades and everything, you have the emergence of various temples and sacred sites. And literally there were thousands of sacred sites that emerged across Maharashtra. And of course there were also big and small polities, right? Political centers. So there were several village-based communities, village-based political centers. Some centers, or states, if you will, they included a bunch of villages. Some were larger states, such as the Bahmani state and the Maratha state. And the politics I'm going to talk about, it happened largely in the Maratha period, which is sort of the 17th century. All right. Now, what happened in the early modern period in Maharashtra? So, because of the opportunities in trading and agriculture, and because there were these, various states that had emerged, there was a lot of opportunities for employment, right? So there were a lot of jobs in administrative positions. There were a lot of openings for priests in the local temples. There were a lot of openings for record keepers, for translators, for diplomats, right? So there are all kinds of sort of wonderful positions had opened. And the people who benefited from these this scenario were the literate communities, right? What we call as the skilled literati, people who were able to produce records, who knew different languages, who knew different scripts, So these were the people who experienced phenomenal sort of social growth and mobility. Now, there was a great demand for priests as well, right? Now, being a priest did not mean that you just go and offer, worship, or you just mediate between gods and human beings. It meant some, seriously juicy entitlements, like, you would have certain privileges. You will get a portion of the income of the village, and then you will enjoy certain, maybe, like perks from the king himself. So, these were the things that a priest would enjoy. So it was not just about, offering worship. It was about, financially more secure. So it was a very lucrative kind of job. Oh yeah, I've already talked about the extraordinary mobility among the literate and the priestly communities. So now, who were these literate communities, right? Who were the key beneficiaries of in this time? So the main people, the people who benefited from this kind of growth were the Brahmins, okay? Because it was the Brahmins who were the literate communities. There were other communities too, but the Brahmins had been there for a long time, right? They had functioned as administrators. They were already working as priests and record keepers and bureaucrats and whatnot. And they, especially in the Bahmani period, which is the 15th century, and in the Maratha period, that's the 17th through the 18th century, no matter what rank of administration, the Brahmins were everywhere. The lower ranks of administration, the middle ranks, the highest ranks, they were the prime ministers. In fact, the Maratha state was led by a line of Chitpavan Brahmins. That was one of the communities in this area. And they were, being Brahmins, they had preference only for Brahmins in administrative jobs. And Chitpavan Peshwas were also the people who kind of tried to enforce the Brahmanical view of society, where Brahmin, he leads from the front. He's like, the Brahmins are the highest class and the Shudras are the lowest class, and that's how they should be kept. So these were some of the boundaries that the Peshwas, the Maratha prime ministers, tried to enforce. Now the leading communities, there were, maybe 20 or 25 Brahmin communities around this time, but the leading communities were the Deshasthas, who were the sort of the indigenous Brahmins, and that the largest community in terms of the numbers. Chitpavans, right? The Chitpavans came mainly from the coastal region, okay, and they were really poor, and they were like little farmers. But then after the Peshwas came to power, and the Peshwas were Chitpavans, as I said, the Chitpavans they really prospered. I mean, the kind of wealth they accumulated by acting as moneylenders and by being these village lords, it was just amazing. And later in the politics of Maharashtra, the Chitpavans also emerged as a major force because they had enjoyed so much patronage in the Maratha period. The Karadas, okay, the Karadas are sort of the inland Brahmins that moved to the coastal regions in search of employment. And then the Saraswats, okay. The Saraswats, they came from Goa, and we'll be learning more about the Saraswats a little later. But they came from down south, okay, they came from Goa. And they were kind of, for a long time, they were considered to be outsiders in the Maratha country because they did not come from come from Maharashtra, right? They came from Goa, which is a neighboring state. Now, what do you have, right, when all these Brahmin communities, they are coming together to secure jobs? Severe competition, right? So they were competing claims over various jobs and entitlements. And like I said, these entitlements involved not just just a regular job, but there were significant land rights. There was tax exemption that was to be enjoyed by Brahmins in who functioned as priests or astrologers or administrators. Hi. All right. So, what was the outcome of the intra-Brahmanical competition, right? That all of them competing for jobs and everything. So, interestingly, when you have a bunch of individuals claiming, or claiming their right as the candidates for a particular job, one would look at the merit of the individual, right? That whether that person is really capable of doing that job or not. However, in this case, the attention was not so much, on individual merit, but rather on the community from which that individual hailed. All right. So when you have a bunch of Brahmin communities competing, the question was not whether this particular individual has the capability to perform this particular job, but whether this individual comes from a truly authentic Brahmin class or not. Okay, so that was the question that was raised at this time. So, and who asked this question? It was the Brahmins themselves, of course, but also the contemporary intellectuals, the political thinkers, who wrote texts, who wrote commentaries, who advised kings on whether or not this particular person was fit for this particular job or not. And all of them debated this question of which community is truly Brahmanical and deserving of the jobs and the entitlements. So there were, various sub-questions within this larger question. So, who is a real Brahmin? One who does not engage in impure jobs such as tilling the land. Now, why is tilling the land an impure job? Because the act of tilling, it leads to violence. Because there are little, insects or bugs in the soil, and when you use that plow, you just end up killing those animals. So, and Brahmins, being pure, individuals, they could not, perform any kind of ahimsa or violence, really. Now, the other question was, someone who performs only priestly duties, is he a Brahmin? Now, this question is very important because many Brahmins at this time, they were not actually working as priests. And therefore, this question became very important. There were Brahmins, like I said, they were administrators, they were teachers, they were record keepers, and everything else. Of course, there were some Brahmins who were priests too. But then, for some Brahmin communities, practicing priesthood became the principal marker of Brahminhood. That if you practice as a priest, only then you are a Brahmin. If you're not, if you're not learning the Vedas, if you're not teaching the Vedas, what kind of Brahmin are you? You're not a Brahmin. Literally that was the argument. Now, the third question was, what is someone who has noble origins, is he a real Brahmin? Now, we have to understand, we are no longer talking about this, this amorphous community of Brahmins that you find in the Vedas, right? Brahmins, that's not just the word you find. You have Chitpavan Brahmins, you have Saraswat Brahmins, you have Karada Brahmins, you have Deshastha Brahmins. Okay, where do you come from? Right? I mean, it is not just enough to say that I am a Brahmin. What kind of Brahmin and what are your origins? Right? Who made you a Brahmin? By whose blessings did you become a Brahmin? Was it a great priest? Was it a deity? Was it some god? Who made you a Brahmin? Where do you come from? That was again a critical question that was asked at this time. And again, the last but not the least, one who eats vegetarian food and avoids meat, is he a real Brahmin? Right? Now, the Brahmins in Maharashtra wouldn't have asked this question had it not been for the Saraswats. Okay? Because the Saraswats, they were the meat-eating others. Right. The other Brahmin communities in Maharashtra, the Chitpavans, the Deshasthas, the Karata, they were pure vegetarians, as they call it in India. However, the Saraswats, okay, where did they come from? They came from Goa, I've already said that, and they were sort of an established community of landowners, government officials, mendicants, and priests. Okay, so they had a certain social standing in Goa. But then during Portuguese rule in the 15th century, many of the Saraswats, they left Goa and they migrated towards Upper Konkan, Maharashtra, right, in search of jobs. And there they enjoyed, in the Maratha state, they enjoyed phenomenal success as administrators because they were pretty smart. They knew Portuguese, they knew English, they knew Marathi, they knew Konkani. So, and they were brave too. In fact, the Peshwa had so many Saraswat commanders in his army. So they, they were doing really well in the Maratha state. And then other Brahmin communities, they started feeling very insecure because of the presence of the Saraswats, right? And they started targeting the Saraswats because the Saraswats were meat eaters. Fish was a very important part of their daily diet. Now, if you've been to Goa, you know, that's what you eat. I mean, you know, what else? You know, you don't just eat, vegetables. You eat meat, you eat fish. And that was sort of the local sort of custom, right? And for the Saraswats, it wasn't a problem when they were in Goa, because in Goa, everybody eats fish. However, in the Maratha country, when there were so many Brahmins who did not eat meat, suddenly it was a big problem, right? Okay. Yeah, so the consumption of meat was construed as an anti-Brahmanical practice by these other Brahmin communities. Now, how did the intellectuals and the Brahmins, how did they respond to this tension and this sort of polarity between Saraswats and other Brahmin communities? They did what Brahmins typically do. They wrote texts, texts in Sanskrit, okay? Yeah, really. That's what you do, right, when you're a Brahmin. You don't go out there and fight. You write texts. There were, a number of texts in which Saraswats, were depicted in a particular manner. So one of the texts is the Sahyadri Khanda, all right? Now the Sahyadri Khanda claims to be part of a great Purana. Purana is this, Puranas are almost treated like scriptures, right? They have, a bunch of stories, but those stories are taken to be real history, right? And so they do enjoy this kind of scriptural status. So now you can imagine when a text like Sahyadri Khanda, it claims to be this great scripture, and then it goes on to write this. For example, the Saraswats, it tells us there were noble Brahmins who were originally living in Bengal, right? But then God Parshurama, okay, he brought them into Goa. Now, who is God Parshurama? I've talked about Vishnu, right? So Parshurama was one of the incarnations of Vishnu. So Vishnu takes form in various, he takes births in various forms across various, times. And Parshurama was one such incarnation of Vishnu. Okay, I don't want to get into the mythology of Parshurama, but he is kind of treated as a major god in Western Maharashtra. So he brought them into Goa. All right. So yes, the Saraswats had great noble origins, as and yes, they were really a noble community. But there was one little problem: they ate fish. Right. Now the Sahyadri Khanda calls the practice of eating fish as a regional fault. Okay, in Sanskrit the word is desha dosha. What's a desha dosha? A desha dosha is a practice which is followed only in a particular region, and it is acceptable only in a particular region. Outside of it, it becomes a problem. So if you eat fish, it's okay. Do it in Bengal, right? It's okay. Don't do it here, because if you do it here, then it's a sin. All right, and then the Sahyadri Khanda kind of briefly alludes to this practice of eating fish among the Saraswats. Now there's another Sanskrit text called the Shataprashna Kalpalatika. Okay, it's basically this compendium of stories of origins of various communities and practices and everything. Basically a historical kind of text. Now, what does it say about the Saraswats? Okay, now it has this again a made-up story about the Saraswats. The Saraswats were originally noble Brahmins, right? So we give them that. Okay, they were great originally, but the place where they lived, okay, it experienced a terrible drought. Okay, there was nothing to eat, and the Saraswats, they took the sacred thread that the Brahmins wear, okay, and they used it for fishing. Okay, and they ate fish. Okay, now because they ate fish, okay, their Brahmanical privileges were withdrawn at a later point. Okay, Brahmanical privileges such as you can learn the Vedas, you can accept ritual donations. So anything that involves any kind of money, right? Those privileges were taken away from the Saraswats. That's the story, right? Now there's one more text called the Shenavi Jati Dharma Nirnaya. Okay, it's sort of it kind of claims to be a true judicial verdict, all right? It is not, all right? But it just claims to be this authentic judicial verdict. And what does it say? It has a very similar story. So in the reign of King Sudanva, a terrible drought forced people to starve, okay? Some Brahmins survived by eating herbs. However, Saraswats, being Saraswats, they were, they could not control their hunger, and they ate the flesh of hawks. Okay, Shena is the word for hawk, and then therefore, the name that was given to the Saraswats was Shenavi. Now, Saraswats sound so nice, right? Like it sounds very exalted. Shenavi, not so much. It's like people really made fun of them because they had the name Shenavi. But anyway, so after the drought was over, the pure Brahmins, who the text tells us were the Karada Brahmins, right? So the vegetarian Brahmins, they purified the Saraswats, but took away their right to carry out 3 Brahmanical functions, that is, teaching the Vedas, officiating at the sacrifice, and accepting ritual gifts. So again, we have a similar story. Okay, so you see the various ways in which the Saraswats were targeted by the vegetarian Brahmins. Now, what are some of the other responses to meat eating? So, if a Saraswat individual, if he wanted to take sannyasa, all right, become a renouncer, he would not be allowed to do so. He had to appear before a committee of Brahmins, and he had to tell them that, hey, I'm really a good Brahmin, I would not eat meat, okay, so please let me go and take sannyasa, right? So that's the kind of justification a Saraswat individual had to give before other Brahmins. Now, the Saraswats were also prohibited from sharing meals with other Brahmins. Now, earlier I said that, if you ate together, that meant that you had an equal status, right? Brahmins eat with Brahmins. Now, because Saraswats ate meat, the other Brahmins, they kind of, refused to share table with them. And therefore, the suggestion was quite clear that if we are not eating with the Saraswats, they are not Brahmins. That was the suggestion. And also the Prime Minister of the Maratha state, who I said was a Chitpavan Brahmin himself, he refused to interdine or share a table with one of his commanders, who was a Saraswat Brahmin. So really, it was, the commander, Jeevba Kherkar, was this phenomenal hero, and he performed, well in so many battles. But when it came to the issue of sharing a table, the Peshwa flatly refused. He said, no, because you're a Saraswat Brahmin who eats meat, I'm not going to share my meal with you. So these were some of the ways in which the Saraswats were targeted. All right, now let's come to the colonial period. What happens in the colonial period? Now the state of Marathas was annexed to the British Kingdom in 1818, right? So the Brahmins in the region, they lost their patronage, okay? And they, the Brahmins who were in the coastal regions and other parts of Maharashtra, they started gravitating towards Bombay, which was the new administrative sort of center and the center of all kinds of political and social and even religious action. And it was not just the Brahmins, of course, there were a bunch of other communities also. But Bombay was a very happening place right from the colonial period. So you had this whole emergence of print culture. There were a lot of printing presses, and there were a lot of public associations by which people mobilized, and they kind of tried to mobilize the members of a particular caste, and they tried to lobby for certain economic benefits that they could get from British government and things like that. Now, Western education was a very important factor. So I think the universities were introduced, like Western style universities were introduced in Bombay in the 1820s and 1830s. And the Brahmins that learned in these universities, they were the liberal Brahmins, right? Now what do I mean by liberal? They wanted to see some social reforms, right? Practices such as widow remarriage, they were in support of the remarriage of widows. They were against child marriage. They were against the practice of sati, which is, widows kind of burning themselves after their husband dies. And these were the kind of changes they wanted to see. But on the other hand, there were Brahmins who did not want to see any kind of change in Indian society, right? So for them, they favored status quo. So let's not change anything. Everything is good as it is. These were the Orthodox Brahmins, right? And this is where, the sort of orthodox Hinduism starts developing, right? Hinduism that's opposed to any kinds of reforms, Hinduism that promotes this kind of social inequality with Brahmins at the top and Shudras at the bottom. These were sort of the things that the Orthodox favored. Now, the key question among the Orthodox was that which community leads the cause of Orthodox Hinduism? Now, one has to understand that at this time, there was a clear equation between Orthodox Hinduism and Brahmins. So if you were a Brahmin, you were an Orthodox Hindu. That was sort of the assumption. Okay. Now, clearly here too, which Brahmin community? Because there were so many of them, right? Indeed, there were many Brahmin communities, but two Brahmin communities were especially competitive, and those were the vegetarian Chitpavans and the meat-eating Saraswats. Okay, so that was again the question that Chitpavans and Saraswats asked each other: that who should become the leader of the Hindus? Who is more orthodox than the other Brahmin communities? That was the question that was asked. All right, now I won't tell you how this debate started because it's a story in itself, but it did start in 1872, and it was this passionate debate where both Chitpavan individuals and Saraswat individuals, they engaged with each other. They wrote letters in newspapers. They held public meetings and openly abused each other. And again, more than any other issue, what was the core issue here? It was, is vegetarianism the core marker of authentic Brahmin status? Isn't it amazing that, people talk about the changes in the colonial period, but as far as this is concerned, little changed, right? And Brahmins, they still argued about whether vegetarian diet should be, the chief marker of authentic Brahmanical status. Now, who is pure, okay? What is whose practice is better? Now, there were two groups, right, among Brahmins. The vegetarian Brahmins in Maharashtra, right, including the Chitpavans, the Karadas and the Deshasthas, and the meat-eating Brahmins, not just the Saraswats, but also in Bengal. Now, Bengal also, being a sort of a coastal region, Brahmins there, they ate fish. It's a very common practice. So the Saraswats actually, they said, hey, Brahmins in Bengal, they eat meat. Are you going to say that they are not Brahmins as well? That was sort of the question that was asked. And then there was again, attention to scriptural sanction for or against the consumption of meat. So where does a Brahmin go when there's a problem? He goes to, look at the scriptures, right? And it's so interesting that, despite all the claims of modernity in colonialism, as far as this issue is concerned, things remain fairly conservative, right? There was attention to, diet and then scriptures and whatnot. And then what happened in this debate? Selective interpretation of the stories and the Dharma scriptures. Now you see, when the stories were written in the pre-colonial period, they circulated in a very small group. Okay, there was no public sphere as such. In the colonial period, there was this, amazing public sphere where, you could publish a book, you could, record your talk, you could take pictures and whatnot. And really, it's so amazing that the Chitpavans and the Saraswats, they each used the scriptures that were written in the past, and in that process, the scriptures that were known only to a select few, they became widely known. Okay, so the Chitpavans, okay, how did they argue against the Saraswats as being this lowly kind of Brahmins? They, dug out all those stories from the Sahyadri Khanda, the Shataprashna Kalpalatika, about how Saraswats lost their Brahmanical status and whatnot, and they selectively appropriated the prescriptions in the Dharma Shastras. Now remember, in the earlier part of my talk, I told you how the discourse in the Dharma Shastras is deeply ambivalent. They both support and do not support the eating of meat. Whereas the Chitpavans, they selectively appropriated only those portions that did not support meat eating and said, hey, the Dharma Shastra scriptures, they do not allow the consumption of meat. So, no, you're not Brahmins. Okay? So, you see, there was this attempt to appropriate the discourse in the Dharma Shastras and present only a particular rules and regulations as normative. Now, the Saraswats, what did they do? All right? Very similar thing. Now, they did not cite the Sahyadri Khanda or other narratives. they went straight to the Mahabharata, which is like the mother of all historical accounts, right? Because the Mahabharata is just this storehouse of real history. Now, they cited this portion from the Mahabharata called the Sutta Samhita, where there's a story, a long story about